Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards.
If you're listening to this podcast, then you're in great company. We've got thousands of listeners who have a thirst for continual improvement and raising standards in business. Whether your interest is in quality, sustainability, or risk standards, I'd love to welcome you as a member to our online platform for all things ISO, the ISology Hub. The ISology Hub is the leading place to get access to all of your online resources, from in-depth training courses through to our very popular coffee break training, to templates and action plans and many other resources to help raise standards. As a member, you get access to over 100 courses, taking you from learner to practitioner to leader. The ISology Hub has all the resources that you need, which will really help to make your life easier and to help improve compliance in those business critical areas. So if you'd like access to learning and compliance resources ranging from data privacy to environmental management, anti-bribery, business continuity, quality, health and safety, to name just but a few, the list is endless actually, then we'd love you to come and join us. Just head over to the isologyhub.com.
Hello everybody, I'm Ian Battersby, Senior ISO Consultant at Blackmores UK Limited. Welcome to another ISO show. Hopefully you've been enjoying our series so far. Today I'm going to talk about documented information. And now I know it's a pretty dry subject, but it's fundamental. And we do continue to face queries on this subject quite a lot of the time. And there do continue to be misunderstandings about the role of documentation in management system standards. So let's clear up the first and possibly most common misunderstanding around documented information. I'm going to talk solely about ISO 9001 now, the quality management standard. Other standards follow exactly the same principles and use the same terminology throughout, and each have their own specific documentation requirements, and indeed 9001 tells you that there are certain things you must do. The most common misunderstandings: 9001 requires you to have a quality manual, and there are certain mandatory procedures, in inverted commas, that it requires. Not true, not anymore anyway. Prior to 2015, when the current version was issued, 9001 did have certain requirements like these in. You did need a quality manual, and there were 6 core procedures, basically, that were mandatory at the time. Control of documents, control of records, internal audit, control of non-conforming product, corrective action, and preventive action. You'll notice that some of those phrases don't even exist in the standard anymore. There were also several mandatory records which were required, covering management review, calibration, supplier evaluation, design and development reviews, those sorts of things. Quite a lot of mandatory records. But since 2015, use of the terms procedure and record, they're not so much redundant, but they've morphed into something else. A single term's been adopted there, which is this term documented information. Essentially, the standard distinguishes between 2 forms of documented information to replace those previous terms. Documented information to be maintained. This is essentially what we would have previously called procedure, describing how something is or should be done. And then documented information to be retained. And this is essentially what we used to call a record. Evidence that we have done something that we were supposed to have done. Okay? The distinction between how we do things And the evidence that we did them still very much exists. We don't use different phrases. So, what changed in the 2015 version? It removed the prescriptive language associated with those old terms and gave organisations the flexibility to develop, control and store documentation, which was important to them. And it no longer dictates the form that documentation must take. So that language is important. In practice, many people still use the terms procedure and record quite informally because they're quite well understood and conveniently descriptive. But beware using language that reinforces the old-fashioned ideas about how we create management systems. This newer language aligns with modern risk-based thinking. Now, I talked at quite some length in the last episode I hosted of the ISO show about risk-based thinking. It is a formal concept in management systems. It's the basis for the modern management systems approach. And to use some actual words from 9001, risk-based thinking is essential for achieving an effective quality management system. The concept of risk-based thinking has been implicit in the past, prior to 2015, but now it is explicit. More words from the standard. To conform to the requirements of this standard, an organisation needs to plan and implement actions to address risks and opportunities. So, no risk management, no certification to any of the management system standards, not just 9001. But while that sort of does sound a little bit like it's quite prescriptive, but adopting the risk-based thinking has allowed a less prescriptive approach, really. It allows us to consider what's significant to us and to plan our own systems accordingly. It's not prescriptive in what we must cover. So the effort we put into documenting something must be consistent with risk. For example, process is very important to you. If its outcome could be in doubt, if it's complex to control, if it could lead to harm or damage, if there's a regulatory requirement, for example, maybe we should put some effort into documenting how it's performed. We decide on that by determining what that risk is. So we maintain documented information in response to the risk to our organisation, not in response to a prescriptive demand in a particular standard. And if a process attracts less risk, then maybe we can deliver that process with a bit less formality, less documentation to be maintained. And that's a judgment for the organisation. And the same goes for retaining documented information to evidence that we've done what we should. So more risk, more documentation, retained to demonstrate that we've controlled that risk. So one size does not fit all anymore. Management system standards are deliberately flexible. The extent of documented information required depends on the size of your organisation, the complexity of your processes, your customers' needs, your regulatory environment, the competence of your people. An organisation of, say, 10 people will have a very different documentation need compared to one of 10,000. Both can fully conform to the standard, but it's about proportionality, not about volume. An audit and certification should assess that proportionality and not try and dictate a prescriptive rule for documentation to any organisation. So, what counts as documented information? Well, the conversation about what we should call things in order to conform to a standard is endless. Standards have all been written with the term documented information to try and get away from this sort of endless conversation. But it's not really worked. Management system standards don't care what you call the documents you maintain in order to govern how you deliver the work you do, your daily activities, your outputs to your customers and to other people. Using the term process and the process approach, is central to 9001 and other standards, and it underpins how systems should interrelate. But 9001 doesn't tell you anything else other than adopting a process approach. So would you like to use the term procedure, or a management procedure, or an SOP, a standard operating procedure, a work instruction, a guidance note, a process map, a playbook, a manual? If you want to, whatever you want to call it, you call it that. Is your activity embedded in an online system, in a workflow, a board of some kind? It doesn't matter. You call it what you want and what is useful to your organization. The standard doesn't say you have to use a specific term, as long as it does the job for you. And, importantly, as long as it's controlled to the extent that it needs to be. And so we come to clause 7.5 in 9001, documented information. First thing it says is the organization's quality management system shall include documented information required by this standard. This is important. You must have the documents that the standard says you have. Okay? And you must have documented information determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the system. So it's the organization's decision, remember, based on risk. And then there's a note. The extent of documented information can differ from one organization to another due to the size of the organization and type of activities, processes, products, and services, the complexity of processes and their interactions, the competence of persons. So the standard just reinforces in its notes what I said earlier. There is no one size fits all, and the standard acknowledges that. Now, the next part of the standard in 7.5.2 is about creating and updating this information. And it says, when creating and updating documented information, the organization shall ensure appropriate. Now, note that word, appropriate. It doesn't indicate specifics. It indicates that you should choose certain things according to your own circumstances. So the appropriate things which you should ensure are identification and description, format and media, and review and approval for suitability and adequacy. So let's take these three things that you should ensure as appropriate and take them individually. So A, identification and description. For identification and description, it has in brackets e.g. a title, date, author, or reference number. So e.g., for example, these are not must-haves. I'm endlessly asked about reference numbers. You don't necessarily need them. You should only really use them if they mean something or make life easier. If they're appropriate, remember that word. I once, in an organisation I worked in, inherited a 9-digit numbering system. Nobody could tell me what the numbers meant beyond the initial 3 relating to the department name. And having department numbering introduces another problem because it reinforces the silo mentality. That's their procedure, not ours. That's got that number on it, so it's got nothing to do with us. What about cross-functional working, end-to-end processes, interrelationships between departments and processes? These are important. And whatever you can do through your documented information to try and break down these silos and these barriers would be quite useful. However, numbers can be important. Anyone who's been involved in construction may be familiar with the mandatory legal notice that has to be submitted to the health and safety executive for construction projects which are over a certain threshold. Nobody calls it by its full name, the Notification of Construction Project form. Everybody calls it an F10. If it's useful, then use it. But if your numbers mean nothing, get rid of them. I did. And nothing says you must show this information in any particular place. Do you want it on your front page, your back page, every page? What matters is that any users are able to easily verify that they have the right thing. And that may be, in an online system, having details embedded in metadata, an information box, for instance, where the user can click on it to see what version number, author, date, whatever it might be that's important to them, can be seen. So the second appropriate thing, which the standard says you should ensure, is that it is appropriate format and media. Now, this is important. This is covering things like language, the written language, so English, French, Dutch, German, whatever that might be. We're getting increasing numbers of organisations with international systems. So language is relevant here. It has to be the language which is understood by the people it's targeted toward. It might be that there are multiple languages used in a workplace, even if it's not an international system. It depends on the type of organisation. Also, you've got to consider the appropriateness of language. Is it understood by the target audience? Is it suitably technical or non-technical according to who you're trying to direct? Format and media also cover things like templates or the layouts which are in use, the look and feel, whether branding is important in your organisation. If people see a QMS document, for instance, which doesn't look like other documents in your organisation, will they begin to feel that it's not really something for that? It's also about the use of things like process flowcharts, diagrams, tables, all written text. What form will your documents take? Will it be all of them? Will it be some of them? It's also about the software or application in which you create your document, a Word or an Excel document, or PDF, or things to be hosted online. And talking of that, this also covers whether your documents are paper-based or electronic. And another thing to ensure is appropriate review and approval for suitability and adequacy. So that's the appropriate review of the content to make sure it does what it should, to make sure all of the things I've just mentioned a moment ago are covered, that the language, the media, the format, the branding, but also that it's actually technical content or otherwise is covered correctly. And also this is about sign off by someone in the organisation with the appropriate authority. And that authority is your choice based on risking it. So the next part of the standard, 7.5.3, is about control in itself. So the method of control of documentation. And this is to ensure things like it is available and suitable for use where and when it is needed. So it must be circulated, hosted, displayed, or whatever it is, so that those people who are required to see it, to use it, to know of its content, its intent, its meaning, to act upon that, can do so. Next, it is to ensure that it is adequately protected. For example, from loss of confidentiality, improper use, or loss of integrity. So this means that it's got to be protected so that only the right people see it, so that anything confidential is not inappropriately shared, so that nobody can use it or amend it without the authority to do so, so that it remains in the manner it was intended and that its content can't be altered, corrupted, destroyed, so that it's always the one and only version that anybody should ever need. Then the standard says, for the control of documented information, the organisation shall address the following activities as applicable. So the things which may be applicable: distribution, storage, preservation, including preservation of legibility, control of changes, for example, versions, retention, and disposition. So this clause adds a bit more meat to some of the ideas discussed already. So, for instance, distribution, access, retrieval, and use. So who receives it and by what means? How is it transmitted to you? Are the right people accessing it? And do they know what to do with it when they do access it? Is it at the point where they need it? And that point is in time and in place. And also you need to consider the sensitivity, as I mentioned earlier, around there may be confidential information being shared within management systems. And then there's storage and preservation, including the preservation of legibility. Now, this is about the physical or electronic of storage, its usefulness, for example, its readability over time. Some things may fade, some things may deteriorate if they are physical objects that need to be viewed. But also, are you protecting physical things from damage through such things as fire, flood, or in another emergency situation? And are electronic formats being protected from obsolescence? If you created a file a number of years ago that needs to be retained for years to come, is it still readable? Can you still open it? We also need to consider areas control changes, for example, version control. So, who is allowed to edit, to authorize, to publish, to issue things, to host them? What's the method for ensuring only relevant current information is accessible by the right people? How are you recording the history of changes where that is necessary? You don't necessarily have to have a history of changes for everything. And then the final part here is the retention and disposition. So how long should documented information be kept? What's useful to you? How have you determined a length of time? What's the regulatory requirement on a piece of information? What does the current customer want? And it's important to lay those things down so that people know how long they need to hold on to things. And then what do you do when you don't need it anymore? How do you to get rid of it? How do you dispose of it? How do you do that securely while also protecting confidentiality where necessary? And how do you prevent access to any obsolete information? All very important. So that's what the standard says. That's all the words around documented information. Finally, though, just touch on one thing. These days, we're seeing more and more management systems relying solely on electronic documentation. This can bring big advantages, but also has some quite deep underlying risks. Well, there are really quite excellent methods for document control in all sorts of hosting, sharing, collaboration platforms. They still need to be managed. Too often we see systems with this sort of level of control in them, but where there are multiple versions of similar documents. Naming disasters, obsolete versions still sitting there being accessed by people, poor formatting, which makes some things unreadable to the user, a lack of authority, people amending things that they shouldn't and issuing things they shouldn't, breaches of confidentiality even. And quite simply, the good old-fashioned inability to find what you actually really need to do your job. So remember, modern systems can help with documented information, but they don't remove the need for managing documentation. Okay, well, that's everything on this very dry subject of documented information. So I'll leave it there. Before I go, I'd just like to remind everybody that they can subscribe to the ISO show on whichever preferred media player they have, if you've not already done so. Please, if you get an opportunity and got a few minutes to spare, leave us a nice, shiny review. 5 stars will be fabulous. This really helps us to reach a wider audience as well. As always, if you've got any questions, want to know anything more about this subject or anything else, you've got any suggestions for future topics, we're always happy to hear from you. So send us an email or comments in the media player. We'd love to hear any suggestions at all. So thank you again. That's all from me today. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.